which case I will give it over to Max. He is the brains and the brawn behind the heater you see on the left there. So please give it up for Max. Welcome him to the stage this morning.
Hi.
Take it away.
I'm Max, and I also had a problem, and I will share a story with you. So I live in Austria, high up in the Alps, and I needed a lot of heat to heat my home. So I burned every single year 2,000 liters of diesel to generate heat for my home. And at the same time, as a Bitcoiner, I started Bitcoin mining in my living room, and I felt, wow, these computers, they get really, really hot. So I thought maybe I can heat with Bitcoin miners. So I built a prototype and was quite surprised it worked in the first winter pretty well. So I saved 2,000 liters of heating oil, which I paid usually 3,000 euros. And of course, I had a drastically higher electricity bill, but I made even 1,000 more with the Bitcoin mining, 1,000 euro profit on the Bitcoin mining. So in total, I was 4,000 euros per winter cheaper with the Bitcoin mining compared to the heating oil. And the best part, which was not my plan, but I was doing it with 100% hydropower, so I saved also 10 tons of CO2 emissions. So it's an absolute no-brainer. So, the problem, only in Europe, we still have 120 million households which are still heating with oil and gas, with fossil fuels. Our thesis is 80% of them, of course, will heat with Bitcoin in 2035. The solution, you can see it over there, it's running, it's really nice. You can touch it in the breaks. It produces Bitcoin. So how does it work? So in Austria, in middle of Europe, the usual energy price is 22 cents. You put in 1 kilowatt hour of 22 cents. You get out in the 4 years average 26 cents for the Bitcoin mining. At the moment, we are now in right after the halving. It's approximately 8 to 10 cents, but in average was 26 cents. And you get the heat, which has, depending on your heating opportunity costs, depending with what you heat, you get an additional 10 cents. So electricity in, 1 kilowatt hour of heat out, there are no losses. 100% of the electric resistance gets converted into heat. So there are no losses by doing 40 trillion calculations per second. So you have a multi-dimensional energy use. And this is how you make 14 cents profit per kilowatt hour. So the competition is the normal heating sources. We have the heat pump, we have the oil heater, and we have the gas heater. And at the same time, we are in the energy transition. Energy transition means we will electrify everything. So in the future, every single home will heat with electricity. And there are not much heating technologies which work with electricity. We have the heat pump, we have infrared, we have direct electric heating, and we have the Bitcoin heating. And Bitcoin heating is the only where you heat your home with energy which has to be used anyway. So even though the heat pump has a higher efficiency, it's a completely new energy consumer, and it's always more sustainable to heat with electricity or with energy which has to be used anyway. And it's also the cheapest and also the CO2 less intensive heating option. So, Bitcoin heating is the most sustainable, it's also the most profitable, and it's also the most future-proof. We are working really hard to make it much smarter. So you can now connect the Bitcoin heater to variable electric tariffs, like Ali talked with the duck curve. So you heat up your home when the electricity is cheap, and you shut down the miner when it's expensive. So you are positive for the grid. And now let's imagine if we grow faster the way we do at the moment, and you have thousands and thousands of these machines in every single country, you can also just say, please do grid balancing for us, and we can provide our customers over electric communities with free electricity. They earn Bitcoin mining with 0 electricity costs, and we do the grid balancing and earn money through that. Yeah, we produce everything in Austria. We are based in Austria. We produce Bitcoin heaters, which we have here. For the private consumer, you can heat 45 square meters with one of these machines. But we have also the plug-and-play industrial heating devices. This one is 9 kilowatts. You can heat hundreds of square meters. And then we have also our grid balancing solution, which are these large Bitcoin mining containers, which Harald will go into in a few seconds. So we are only 28 months in business. We already shipped out 4,000 orders. And in our second year, we did already 2 million in revenues. And we have 17,000 Bitcoin miners in stock. And we are already now 22 employees. So we are growing really, really fast. The most important key performance indicator of our company is, of course, what do our customers say? And they love our products, which we love. So now I will hand over to Harald.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maximilian. So I go next, and I go back. Okay. So this is the consumer perspective, and what Max has alluded to already is that we saw more and more demand in larger capacity. So we were approached by customers that said, okay, this is one miner, this is all nice and dandy, can you do this at larger scale? We need to high heat swimming pools, we need to heat our aqua farms, we need to monetize our surplus energy. And we ran into two perspectives that sort of couldn't be further away from each other. We had very bullish entrepreneurs that wanted solutions for the problems, but we also ran into regulators, politicians, energy power generators that were very skeptical of the solution itself. So what we thought is really important, as Rachel has already alluded to, we need to educate on a broader scale what Bitcoin means for the big questions that Europe is facing at the moment. And at the end of my conversation, I will also bring it back to what these heaters actually have to do with energy sovereignty in Europe. So if we bring it back to the infamous energy trilemma, it is a question that could not be more timely for Europe. If we look at this, let's call it a conundrum as well, because between the question of energy independence of a nation, of a sovereign or continent, the availability and the abundance of energy and the energy security, so how safe can supply meet demand, we see that Europe had the tricky historical burden that it could only optimize for two of these dimensions. So if we play this through for a second, shall we, then Europe has focused on energy abundance and energy security through importing of cheap, in this case, Russian gas, and sacrifice its independence. Now, through this conflict and the war, this independence has been jeopardized, obviously. So Europe decided to onshore a lot of its power generation to regain energy independence, capacity-wise for sort of the same type of comparable capacity in terms of availability of energy abundance. But of course, this was a very different nature of energy. It was not a base load net gas that you could store, that you could burn on site and generate power, but it was very much intermittent energy. So something that puts a very, very different burden onto the grid infrastructure and jeopardizes energy security. So what we now need, and we heard this already, like all my colleagues were teeing this up really nicely for me, that we need to obtain energy security, we need stable grids, and that requires the optimal asset utilization, and it needs new forms of flexibility management within these grid infrastructures. And that brings us to technically 3 different solutions that we are trying to address on a B2B level with our Bitcoin containers, our 21 energy Bitcoin containers, which we know our assets are underutilized, either because they cannot capitalize fully by feeding into the grids, or have some other challenges why the asset cannot be fully monetized. So what we call power surplus monetization as a buyer of first or last resort, Bitcoin mining is not only valuable in Africa or in the Azores or in the US, but also in Europe. And because the dominant contributor to the supply in Europe is becoming and will be increasingly intermittent energy, so mostly PV, solar PV and wind, the grid balancing, both from the negative side, so sucking surplus power for frequency stabilization from the grid, and supplying power to the grid in case there's over demand and under supply. So these are the three main domains that we want to make a case for, that Europe needs to take very seriously and take Bitcoin mining very seriously if we want to obtain or want to regain full sovereignty, energy sovereignty. And you could do so, and this is now not news for you, that you could do so by providing grid supporting services, by converting excess power into a digital commodity and heat. And I want to go through that relatively quickly because it has been said several times. There are just some very, very interesting features, and put yourself now into the shoes of a regulator, of a policymaker, of a European Union politician. Now I'm wearing sort of both hats from EBEA and from 21 Energy as well. There's a lot of risk perception around Bitcoin, and so we need to sort of convince also from the technical expertise and technical feature perspective to make the case for Bitcoin mining as a grid servicing instrument. So we've talked about the uptime flexibility. You want to have something that can run at almost indefinite capacity continuously over almost infinite time frames. You want to be as mobile and as location agnostic as possible. In Germany, we have the situation that in summer, the south of Germany generates an incredible surplus of PV power, which is not being fed into the grid and is curtailed. On the other hand, in winter, there's a lot of surplus power from wind in the north of Germany. So you want to have an instrument that can capitalize on both events. Future-proofness is going to be a big issue for the European narrative around energy resilience. And one of the important elements on that, in that regard is the heat reusability. So if we want to make an argument for future-proof infrastructure in the European energy infrastructure, it is really that our infrastructure and our instruments that we put on should be as energy efficient and as possible, and energy efficiency in that regard also means that we use the heat and we monetize as much out of the power that we use as possible, and heat reusability is one big element. Now when we look, and I will come to this in a second because I really want to also give you a perspective on the regulatory environment of where this is all going, because it builds the enabling environment for these use cases to actually take full effect. It is that there is a strong need from the European regulators' perspective to show symmetric scalability. So we want there's an encouragement within the energy infrastructure to provide grid balancing instruments that can work both ways. So batteries are one of these typical examples that can both suck power out of the grid, but it can also supply power to the grid. And last but not least, and this has been mentioned often, and it cannot be mentioned often enough, the responsiveness for these grid balancing services is incredibly important. We talk about a tiered system, primary, secondary, and tertiary markets, and they really differ only in their need to how responsive the grid balancing instrument has to be, and it spans from a few seconds to several hours to days. Now, who are the typical usual suspects that perform these jobs at the moment? So I love what Daniel said about the expensive battery. I would add to that it's a what did you say? It's a big battery. I would add it's an expensive battery. Pumped hydro usually performs this job as this symmetrical balancer. We have an emergence of battery energy and storage infrastructure. Typically demand response, so curtailing of large power consumers and delaying their power consumption has been a big contribution to the grid balancing. And then, of course, especially for the positive side, there have been the diesel generators and the flexible net gas peaker plants, all of which, and I don't want to bother you with the details below, but all of which have individual strengths and weaknesses. They are either super pricey, very pricey and fast, very capacity rich but slow, or they are very pricey and very CO2 emission intensive. And that is something that the European infrastructure, energy infrastructure, will look for to be marginalized as much as possible. So what we are proposing, and you saw the concept already really pioneered by Eric as well, and Gridless, the modularity of what we call the 21 energy mining container that is flexible, scalable, responsive, and geographically agnostic buyer of power is one that we can introduce that optimizes for all of these components. Now, we won't have time to go into all of the different use cases, and we're super happy to answer all of your questions. But what we can promise is, and Ali has mentioned and alluded to that in his conversation or in his talk, it is really all about the economics. Money talks. So if you get a higher resource utilization out of your asset, it means that you have, of course, improved contribution margins. It means that you can squeeze more profit out of the asset. Because grid balancing infrastructure is usually expensive, curtailing power is expensive, stabilizing grids is, as I said, expensive. So if we can decrease the overall cost for the flexibility management, we can also bring overall power prices down, which has also been shown by different various research. And it's super important, the signaling for future investments. Europe will need much more energy in the future than we're using right now. And most of this, or predominantly, this energy will be renewable build out. So we need to de-risk these future investments by having this buyer of first resort that immediately monetizes the value of these assets without having the grids as immediately necessary counterparties for trade. And because the dominant, and this is where Europe is strongly pushing into in this direction, is that the use cases for grid balancing infrastructure have to be predominantly renewable based. It also means that we will be able to squeeze and marginalize the more expensive and less efficient carbon intensive grid balancing infrastructures like the diesels and the gas plants of this world, which means that we get also the overall CO2 inventory of our power supply down, which is a dominant goal of the European Union, policy-wise. And as Eric has said so wisely, and I think this cannot be stressed enough, a lot of power, a lot of abundant power means also the basis for societal prosperity, and this is ultimately what we want to achieve. So if we want to bring this back now and want to bring this home, for us as Bitcoiners that offer these solutions, it is a technical solution, yes, but we also need to de-risk the decision-making for people whose support we need, either because they are counterparties of our projects or because they are policymakers that write the regulations about these future or the future nature of the grid. And if we bring this all home now, we can now paint a picture where it actually makes sense to onshore and reshore power generation and become energy independent and increase now the energy abundance, because we have this buyer of first resort that really monetizes existing assets, so increases the asset utilization, but also monetizes new build-outs, which there is plenty of. And because we now find new ways of increasing the quality and the quantity of demand-side responsiveness, we can actually now make the case for Bitcoin to be this catalyst that actually for the first time really allows us to offer to solve for all three dimensions, which is ultimately the goal for the European energy sovereignty. Now, because we do this conversation often with power generators and policymakers, I'm usually adding a little excursion into the regulatory field, and I'm sorry that I have to bother you with that, but I hope that it's a little bit useful. Because if you take anything away, there are just 3 directives, 3 regulations that are actually ultra bullish Bitcoin. And these are the 3. There's the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and the Electricity Market Design Directive. Why are these three relevant? They essentially summarize a couple of things. The first one is new build-out needs to be renewable. We know that that's bullish Bitcoin because we look for the cheapest sources of electricity. It also says we need to be energy efficient. That means heat reuse is becoming mandatory for compute. So we know that we want to do this anyways because Bitcoin mining needs multiple revenue streams to be profitable. But energy efficiency not only means exchanging the light bulbs, but also being more efficient in meeting supply, meeting demand. So in the matchmaking of the markets, and we know that Bitcoin mining as the buyer of first and last resort can play a critical role there as well. And lastly, and this is super important, and it's the piece that brings sort of this heater home into the conversation of the European energy markets. It's the Electricity Market Design Directive, which essentially says if you have a net positive effect onto the grid for the grid, and if you're doing services that are in service of grid stability, you cannot by no means be marginalized or discriminated in the market, irrespective of why you consume this power. And it liberates the European market for use cases where we can now start to say, well, this miner here, this heater, is standing somewhere in a private home, but through the power of aggregation of capacity, we can now bid with this aggregated capacity for grid stabilizing services into the market. And through these new regulations, these type of business models cannot be discriminated anymore. So if we can show this, and we are in the process of building the technology stack and the partnership stack to actually do this, it offers completely new business model because as Max said, then we can suddenly offer these machines almost for free because we monetize the capacity in the markets for grid balancing services. So there is a net positive effect for the decentralization of usage of power, less need for transmission, more asset utilization, more profitability, more energy security. And if you allow me just one more step to go a little bit further, because we are bullish on Europe being on Bitcoin mining in Europe, and there are still ways, and this is where we work with a double hat of business or entrepreneurs and policy advisors through our competence at EBEA. We want to take this a bit further and do not only comply and use existing regulation to the best of our ability and profitability, hopefully, but also to take it a step further and enshrine Bitcoin mining even further into the European legislation. So four stand out here, one of which is if Bitcoin mining is really such an important flexible load and a force to reckon with in grid stabilization practices, it should not be just another energy consumer or treated as such. It should be dealt with as a critical grid asset. When it comes to project finance, Rachel has alluded to that. When it comes to project finance, it is critically important in the European context to know a concept of the EU taxonomy, because as bureaucrats usually do, they define things and then everybody needs to follow them, irrespective of whether they make sense or not. But it essentially defines activities that are in line with the ESG practices and goals of the European Union and which ones are not. And if something like Bitcoin mining has so many net positive effects on the economic, on the geopolitical, and on the environmental side, it should be explicitly mentioned in this EU taxonomy because the consequences are big. It means that it unlocks completely new pools of capital that could finance these projects, and it's financing that we desperately need. We need better incentives. When we talk about grid balancing, for instance, batteries are great, but they're expensive, but they have other problems as well. One of the problems is that if you start to engage with the grid, you usually pay penalties for using this infrastructure. This is expensive, and it alters, and it comes as an additional cost onto your project, on your project costs. So if you do these net positive services for the grid and the grid stability, you should be exempt and should have better incentive. And Bitcoin mining should be in that bucket as well. And we know that because the rollout, and that's the fourth point and the last one, because the rollout is so fast in terms of new capacity, new generation capacity, we need much more of this flexible load and flexible consumers to come online. So if you can prove that you are one of these positive contributors to grid stability, then you should be treated as such, and you should have priority access to the infrastructures to perform your task. So to bring this home, there is indeed a link between this machine and the European energy sovereignty. And we need to tell the story also from this point, because we will need critical people along the way, both on the private sector and on the public sector, to leverage the full potential of what is already there in terms of infrastructure, commissioned rollout, regulation, and new kits in town like Bitcoin mining as a grid balancer in its various forms as off-takers or off-takers and heaters to get the maximum value for Europe, and that's actually what we really want. So thank you very much for your attention.